the room they never wanted me to own. They thought I was the decoration in the room. That day, I became the architect of their collapse. I remember the first time I stepped into that boardroom as the lead negotiator. 12 men in tailored suits, a city skyline sprawling behind them, and me, the only black woman in a room that had been designed, for generations, to exclude me. But I wasn't there for show. I was there because I'd spent the last 11 months weaving together the most delicate, high-stakes logistics deal our company had ever attempted. I had studied every nuance of our partners' culture, learned their unspoken rules, and earned a seat at this table the hard way. Not through Ivy League cocktails or golfing weekends, but through the grind, endless flights, lost weekends, and quiet, consistent wins. In every negotiation, my grandmother's voice echoed in my head. They will try to take your piece. Never let them own it. Richard Hale didn't understand that kind of work. Richard was new parachuted in with a pristine resume, a halo of privilege, and the kind of confidence you can only have when the world has never told you no. His handshake was firm, his smile was camera-ready, and his belief in his own genius was absolute. He liked to say he cut through the noise. In truth, he bulldozed it. He saw diplomacy as weakness, cultural fluency as a nice-to-have, and me, as in his words, our in-house cultural translator. I remember the first time he said it. I was presenting a market entry strategy in front of the senior leadership team. He leaned back in his chair, sipped his espresso, and smirked. Amara makes sure they like us. I make sure we get what we want. The room laughed politely. I didn't. Still, I didn't see him as a threat then. I thought the work would speak for itself. I thought results would shield me. I thought wrong. It was in Johannesburg where the fault line first cracked open. The deal, valued at just over $200 million, was entering its final, most delicate stage. Our partners, a major African logistics conglomerate, had trusted me enough to open their books, share their vulnerabilities, and discuss joint AI infrastructure planning. Trust in Africa is a currency more valuable than capital. It is earned slowly and lost instantly. I had earned it. Richard had not. Yet here he was, 15 minutes late to the most critical meeting of the year, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and the arrogance of a man who believed charm could erase incompetence. He breezed into the room with a joke about taking this deal to the moon and a wink at our partners. No one laughed. When I began addressing the integration clauses in Swahili, as I had done in every prior meeting, he interrupted, switching to English. Let's not give away too much here. We've got leverage. The air thickened. Our partners exchanged glances, the kind that say more than words. Richard mistook their silence for agreement. I knew it was the sound of trust beginning to evaporate. That night, over drinks with a junior colleague, Richard let his real thoughts slip. Look, Amara's good at making friends. But this is about hard strategy now. My lane. She's just a piece of the puzzle. A piece. Not a partner. Not a leader. Just a piece. I went home to my hotel room and stared at the city lights until dawn. I knew what was coming, though I didn't yet know how or when, but I started preparing. Quietly. Strategically. Like my grandmother used to say. You don't need to raise your voice when you're sharpening a blade. The thing about Richard is that he wasn't reckless by accident. He was reckless by design. He believed in the big move, the dramatic gesture that would leave everyone stunned and scrambling. And he thought I'd be the perfect casualty to prove his dominance. What he didn't know was that I had already started building a life beyond the company. Contacts who'd whispered, "If you ever leave, call us." Late-night notes scribbled on hotel stationery about a business model that would be mine alone. Quiet lunches with legal consultants about independent contractor structures. And yes, the faint outline of a company name, AD Global Partners. Still, I played my part. Saturday in the meetings. Spoke when needed. Let him think he was in control. Because Richard's arrogance was my camouflage. The louder he became, the easier it was for me to disappear into the quiet and work unseen. The morning it happened, the air in Johannesburg was heavy with summer heat. We were set to finalize the operational autonomy clauses, the very heart of the deal. I took my seat across from our partners, their COO greeting me with the kind of warmth that can only come from shared battles. Then the door opened. Richard walked in, and from the glint in his eye, I knew the moment had come. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because Richard had no idea the clock was already ticking. The public execution. The glint in Richard's eye was not the look of a man walking into a negotiation. It was the look of a man walking into a performance. He adjusted his cufflinks like they were armor, let his gaze sweep the room as though he owned it, and flashed a smile that had no warmth in it. I stayed seated, pen resting between my fingers, the contract draft I had spent 6 painstaking weeks perfecting lying neatly in front of me. The discussion began again, the partners leaning in as I clarified the integration clauses in their language. I felt their focus return, the rhythm of trust knitting itself back together stitch by stitch. And then, without warning, Richard's voice cut through the air like a blunt blade. "Before we move forward," he began, projecting his voice to the far corners of the room, "there's an important update to share." My stomach tightened, but my face remained still. "Effective immediately," he continued, looking not at me, but straight past me. "Amara will no longer be with the company. We're making some strategic changes, but rest assured, our leadership team remains committed to this partnership." He did not say my name with gratitude or respect, only as an administrative note in his theater of dominance. It was surreal. In the seconds after his words, the entire room seemed to still. The COO froze mid-pour, the teapot suspended above a delicate porcelain cup, as though gravity had paused in disbelief. One of the senior executives blinked hard, as if trying to decode whether they had heard correctly. My ears rang, not from panic, but from the sudden razor-edged clarity that comes when the truth arrives all at once. He had been waiting for this, planning it not as a quiet HR process, but as a public execution meant to humiliate me and cement his control over this deal. Richard's mistake was assuming I had nowhere to stand if he pulled the ground from beneath me. I slowly set my pen down, rose from my seat, and turned toward the partners with a polite nod. In flawless Swahili, I said, "I apologize for this unexpected development. I understand this may raise concerns for your company." Richard tried to step in, that smug lilt in his voice. "Let's stay on track, folks. We have a deal to close." But the COO raised a hand with the calm precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He looked directly at me, not Richard, and asked, "May I inquire what your next role will be?" The breath in the room shifted. Richard's smile faltered. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the power shift. I met the COO's gaze and felt an unexpected calm settle in my chest, the kind of calm that comes when the worst has already happened, and all that remains is choice. "I haven't decided yet," I replied in measured tones, "but I am open to new partnerships." The COO nodded once, the flicker of respect in his eyes impossible to miss. He then spoke a single word to his team, a word that signaled a break. They rose in unison, leaving their folders untouched. Richard, mistaking the pause for a victory, leaned toward me and muttered, "You should have seen this coming. You were overpaid and overhyped." I didn't flinch. "You just fired your only cultural bridge and the architect of this entire deal," I said evenly. "All to prove you could." He smirked, leaning closer. "Enjoy job hunting." That was when I let the blade turn. "I already have an offer," I said softly. 3 weeks ago. I turned it down. "I think I'll accept it now." For the first time since he walked in, he had no script. His smile faltered just enough for me to see the crack beneath the veneer. The door opened then, and the COO returned alone. He took his seat across from me, not once acknowledging Richard, and in Swahili asked, "Would you be willing to continue this discussion independently?" There was no hesitation in my answer. "I would be delighted." Richard tried one last time to hold the ground. "I'm sorry," he began, "but we're still the—" The COO lifted an eyebrow, and his voice cut clean through the tension. "The contractual relationship appears undefined at the moment. I would appreciate it if Orbis Tech's representatives could give us the room." It wasn't a suggestion. Richard's jaw twitched, but he knew resistance would only make the humiliation sharper. He gathered his papers with jerky, precise movements and left without another word. The silence that followed was the kind that rewrites the air. I didn't rush to fill it. I let it breathe, let the gravity of the shift settle between us. Then, slowly, I turned the contract around to face the COO. "The proposal still stands," I said, "with one change: my title." From my folder, I slid out a clean document. No company logo. No corporate watermark. Just my name and my terms. I am now operating as an independent consultant. All clauses remain as agreed. My compensation will shift to a success-based model, 10% payable upon execution. He studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You already had this ready," he observed. I allowed the faintest smile. "I've been prepared." What I didn't tell him was that preparation had begun the day Richard arrived, the day I realized my work would never be enough for a man who saw me as a prop in his show. I had built my escape in shadows, layer by layer, knowing one day the curtain would fall. That day had arrived, and the stage was mine. For the next hour, we spoke not as employer and employee, but as equals. We adjusted timelines, refined clauses, and sketched a phased rollout that would give my new firm greater leverage in the region. When his deputies returned, their eyes went first to me, not to Richard's empty chair. The COO rose, extended his hand, and said, "This is how business is meant to be done." I shook it, not with relief or triumph, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had just rewritten the terms of her own survival. By the time I left the building, the late afternoon sun had turned Johannesburg's skyline to gold. I paused outside the revolving doors, looking up at the glass tower that had once felt like a fortress. It looked the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. It no longer owned me. This time, no one takes it away. I smiled then, not because the battle was over, but because I knew the war had just begun. The silent siege. When I stepped out of that glass tower into the heavy Johannesburg heat, the city didn't know it had just witnessed a quiet coup. People hurried past with briefcases, vendors shouted over the smell of grilled corn, taxi doors slammed, life moved on. But in my chest, something settled with deliberate calm. I was no longer Orbis Tech's lead negotiator. I was the architect of my own empire. The first rule of a siege is patience. You don't storm the gates, you weaken the walls until they crumble under their own weight. I went back to my hotel, drew the blackout curtains, and opened my laptop. AD Global Partners already existed on paper: a Singapore registration, a pristine one-page website, a clean black and white logo, designed by a freelancer in Prague. No public announcements. No LinkedIn profile. No traceable ties to me. It was a ghost, but it was mine. I didn't blast my new role across social media. I didn't send out a triumphant email. Instead, I began to move in whispers. My first contact was a CEO I'd once guided through a complex customs dispute in Nairobi. The email was short. "Hope this finds you well. I'm working on something new, specializing in adaptive market entry. Discretion guaranteed." Attached was a white paper I'd written months ago, detailing a solution to a problem Orbis Tech had ignored for years. It didn't need my signature. They knew my style. Within 24 hours, they replied, "When can we talk?" That was the rhythm of it. One by one, I reached out to people who had trusted me long before Richard Hale had even learned to pronounce their names. I didn't pitch. I offered help. I sent research, tailored analyses, strategic frameworks I had carried in my head for years. And because these were my ideas, my work, my fingerprints, they didn't belong to Orbis Tech. They belonged to me. Meanwhile, I watched Richard try to replace me with a woman from the London office who spoke fluent French but couldn't manage a proper greeting in Swahili. I imagined her sitting across from the COO, mispronouncing his name, watching the trust drain from the room with each syllable. It wasn't cruelty, it was inevitability. You cannot fake cultural fluency. But I didn't gloat. I worked. I scheduled late-night signal calls with clients in Tokyo. I walked the quiet parks of Singapore during long phone negotiations. I met potential partners in cafes no one photographed. My phone buzzed constantly, but my name never appeared in their inboxes. Everything flowed through encrypted channels, silent and precise. Then came the first crack in Orbis Tech's armor. A client in Ghana went dark. No returned calls, no signed renewals. A German logistics firm suddenly postponed its quarterly review. A Singapore startup canceled a workshop at the last minute. I didn't poach them. I didn't have to. I simply made myself available in the void Richard had created. I rented my first office a month later. It was small, just 2 rooms on the 12th floor of a building that smelled faintly of new paint and ambition. When I signed the lease, the pen trembled in my hand. I laughed then, softly at first, and then harder until my eyes stung. Alone in that echoing room, I sat cross-legged on the bare floor, tears slipping down my cheeks. I wasn't crying for what I'd lost. I was crying because for the first time in years, I was building something no one could take from me. This time, no one takes it away. I didn't hang a sign on the door. I didn't tell the receptionist my full name. My work wasn't about visibility, it was about precision. I hired a small team, each one handpicked for their discretion and cultural intelligence. We didn't wear matching lanyards or issue corporate memos. We met in corners of tea houses, in quiet airport lounges, in borrowed conference rooms where no one knew our names. And while Richard posed for corporate headshots and spoke on panels about navigating cross-cultural partnerships, I was quietly rewriting the map. By the end of the quarter, 3 of Orbis Tech's largest APAC accounts were mine. No headlines, no lawsuits. Just contracts signed under the clean, untraceable banner of AD Global Partners. But a siege is not without its noise. One morning, an encrypted message appeared in my inbox. They're drafting a retroactive non-compete. Richard's pushing hard. Wants to frame your client contact as sabotage. I stared at the words for a long time, then smiled. Not the smile of someone surprised, but the smile of a chess player who knows the opponent has walked directly into a trap. I had the receipts. Every ignored HR request for updated contract terms. Every email from legal promising to follow up and never doing so. The one damning message from Richard himself. Don't waste legal's time, just cut her access. I zipped the files, encrypted them, and sent them to my lawyer. Then I poured myself a glass of water and went back to work. Because the beauty of a siege is this. Once the walls start cracking, all you have to do is keep pressing. And I wasn't done pressing, not even close. The collapse. It started as whispers. Investors asking careful questions. Project managers reporting strange silences from long-standing clients. Junior account executives biting their nails over contracts that used to be routine renewals. Richard dismissed it all as transition noise. But transitions end. Silence doesn't. Inside Orbis Tech, they were beginning to choke on the quiet. A Korean distributor refused to sign their Q1 agreement without speaking to Miss Daniels or no one at all. A Japanese partner pushed a critical product launch 6 months back. A German VP, once loyal to the brand, sent a polite but unmistakable email. We will not be renewing at this time. Richard tried to spin it at the Monday leadership meeting. It's just a temporary vacuum. We'll regain their confidence. But the room's stillness told another story. No one believed him. I didn't need to watch their meetings to know the panic was spreading. It reached me in other ways, a half-dozen LinkedIn connection requests from employees I barely knew, encrypted messages from middle managers whispering about unofficial inquiries from the board. One night, my phone buzzed with a single line from a former colleague. "They're coming for you!" They tried. Orbis Tech's legal department scrambled to piece together a retroactive non-compete, backdating language, drafting claims of interference with corporate relationships. My lawyer laughed when she saw the documents. They can't enforce a contract that never existed, she said. And then I sent her the evidence. Every unanswered HR request I'd filed. Every internal promise to circle back. The smoking gun Richard's own email saying he'd handle my exit personally, bypassing legal entirely. This isn't just sloppy, my lawyer said. This is fatal. I didn't stop there. I packaged the evidence into 2 separate envelopes. One went to a board member I knew would understand the weight of it. The other went to a journalist at Business Week who had been circling Orbis Tech for months. My cover note was simple: if you want to see what a weaponized oversight looks like, call me. 2 days later, the boardroom cracked. I wasn't there, but I heard the story from two different sources. Richard walked into the quarterly meeting expecting to explain away market turbulence. Instead, Martin Levy, the founding investor, stood and handed the general counsel a stack of printed emails. "These," Martin said evenly, "are your head of APAC Strategy's termination records, or rather, the lack thereof." The room went still. Someone near the back asked, "You mean she was never bound by a non-compete?" Martin nodded. "And her firm is doing exactly what we used to hire her for, only better." Richard tried to recover. "So, what, we just let her dismantle us from the outside?" Martin didn't blink. "Number? We ask how she did it. And why you made it possible." The rest of the meeting was bloodless but terminal. Richard's allies stayed silent. His enemies sharpened their knives. That afternoon, the journalist called. "I've heard rumors," she said, "but this is smoke with a bonfire underneath." She wanted an off-the-record meeting. I agreed. We sat in a quiet corner of a hotel cafe in Singapore, her recorder off, her notebook closed. I gave her the story: dates, facts, receipts, no bitterness, just truth. And then, I walked away. When the article dropped, it wasn't a tabloid explosion. It was a scalpel cut. The headline was precise: "Collapse at Orbis Tech, inside the quiet coup that reshaped the APAC market." My name appeared in the fifth paragraph. Amara Daniels, founder of AD Global Partners. No glamour shot, no triumphant quotes. Just the fact that I now held the contracts Orbis Tech had once called its crown jewels. The impact was immediate. Orbis Tech stock dropped 8% in a day. Calls from investors poured in. The board demanded an emergency strategy session. Richard was placed on administrative leave pending review. The company scrambled to reassure clients, but it was too late. Silence had turned to absence. Absence had turned to loss. Meanwhile, I was in a rented office on the 47th floor of a tower in Raffles Place, signing the largest contract of my career. 3 times the size of the original Orbis Tech deal. 3 regions, multi-currency, full operational control delegated to AD Global. My new partners didn't want middlemen. They wanted me. I should have felt victory. I didn't. What I felt was ownership. Ownership of my name, my work, my legacy. No one could take that away now. I looked out the window at the Singapore skyline glowing against the evening. The glass towers no longer intimidated me. They were just buildings. And I no longer asked permission to enter. Still, one last battle remained. Richard's shadow hadn't fully lifted. Orbis Tech was wounded, but not yet dead. They could still try to spin the narrative, to salvage what was left of their pride. But the thing about pride is it makes you predictable. And predictability is the easiest thing to dismantle. So I began to plan the final move. Not to end them, but to define myself in a way they could never touch again. The war wasn't over. It was about to end on my terms. The return. The final move didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in silence, in the kind of stillness where power shifts without a sound. By the time Orbis Tech called their so-called ethics review, I had already decided how this would end. They invited me to testify voluntarily. I accepted without hesitation. Not for revenge, but for truth. On the morning of the review, I stood outside their headquarters in Singapore. The building rose in mirrored steel, reflecting a city that had no memory of the young woman who once walked through its doors with hope in her chest. I placed my hand on the cool glass for just a second. It felt exactly the same as it had the first day I joined. The only difference was me. I wasn't walking in to belong. I was walking in to speak. Inside, the air was brittle. Board members in tailored suits lined the far side of the table. Richard wasn't in his usual chair. He sat off to the side, shoulders tight, jaw set, a shadow of the man who once believed he could own every room. The chairperson welcomed me politely. I didn't waste time. I laid out the facts, the ignored HR requests, the absent contracts, the bypassed legal processes. I explained, in calm, unshakable tones, how the company's own negligence had freed me from every constraint they thought they had placed on me. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply told the truth. When I finished, the room was quiet. One board member closed his notebook slowly. Another looked at me as if he'd just realized the cost of underestimating me. Richard said nothing. He couldn't. The documents in front of him spoke louder than any defense he might have tried. I left without shaking his hand. 3 days later, the news broke. Not from me, never from me, but from the same journalist who had followed the trail from the beginning. Orbis Tech implodes. Internal failures and a leadership meltdown in APAC. My name was in the first sentence this time. The story was everywhere. Bloomberg, the Financial Times, every LinkedIn feed that had once celebrated Richard's empty victories. The company's market value dropped another 14% in 48 hours. Investors called for a leadership overhaul. And Richard? He disappeared from the industry news cycle, like a man who had never existed. That night, I walked into my new office, the same 2 rooms I had rented months before. But now, the space was alive. Files lined the shelves. Contracts waited in neat stacks on my desk. My team worked quietly in the next room, voices low, focused, certain. I closed my office door, sat at my desk, and opened a plain envelope. Inside was the first check from our largest new client. The amount didn't matter. I stared at the signature, traced the ink with my fingertip, and let the moment settle in my bones. I laughed soft at first, then louder until tears blurred my vision. Because it wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that I had taken everything they tried to use against me and turned it into the foundation of my future. I wiped my eyes, leaned back in my chair, and whispered to the empty room. This time, no one takes it away. Weeks later, I stood on stage in Cape Town at an industry summit, delivering the keynote address. The room was full executives, entrepreneurs, young professionals who had fought their way into spaces like this against odds that didn't favor them. I told them what I knew now, that survival in the corporate arena isn't about playing their game better, it's about building your own table. And when they tell you you're not invited, it's about walking in anyway, pulling up your own chair, and leading the conversation. The applause was long, but it wasn't for me alone. It was for everyone in the room who had been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased. It was for everyone who had sharpened their blade in silence. Later that evening, I passed Orbis Tech's booth on the conference floor. It was smaller now, the staff standing awkwardly behind a modest display. No one recognized me at first. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I had already taken back everything that mattered. As I stepped out into the warm night air, I thought of my grandmother's words, the ones she gave me before my first job interview, the ones I carried through every closed door and hostile boardroom. They will try to take your peace. Never let them own it. And I smiled, because I finally understood. They never owned it in the first place. If you've ever been underestimated, tell your story. Because here, we don't just survive, we lead. And we make sure they remember exactly how we did it.